Welcome to Talking Strategy. My name is Paul O'Neill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Talking Strategy is a RUSI podcast series in which Professor Beatrice Husa and I talk to experts about strategy and the strategists that have helped shape our ideas about the world. Standing on the shoulders of these strategy giants, the series will provide an introduction to key thinkers from across the ages and across the world, in which we will be examining the influences on them and the impact they have had on us and our potential adversaries. So, allow me to hand over to my friend and colleague. Beatrice, welcome. The chair is yours.
We are very privileged to have with us today the doyen of military historians, Professor Stig Förster. He has just completed a huge history of war and the military in Central Europe, which should definitely be translated into English. His trailblazing series of international research and publication projects on the history of total war will be known to all students of strategy. Originally a Berliner, Professor Förster is ideally placed to tell us about three Prussian strategists. The first one to mention would be Colmar von der Goltz, born 1843 and died in 1916, also known as Goltz Pasha because he worked for the Ottoman Empire on their military. Two of his most important books are The Conduct of War, published in 1899, and The Nation in Arms in 1906. So, Professor Förster, would you start by telling us a little bit more about the man and about his most important ideas?
Well, he was certainly one of the most important German strategists, military thinkers, and theorists of the period. He was a disciple of the elder Moltke, Helmut von Moltke, the chief of the General Staff during the Franco-Prussian War, for example. And he continued more or less in that theoretical tradition. However, he radicalized the ideas of Moltke, and he became something like an advocate of total war. And he had the opportunity to carry some of his ideas into practice during the First World War while fighting on the Ottoman front in what is nowadays Iraq.
May I interrupt you there and ask you for your authoritative definition of total war, because the word hadn't actually been invented before 1918.
Right. The thing is, we had 5 international conferences on that topic, and we ended up with the fact that there is no definition. But what you have is, of course, the elements of total war: total mobilization, total disregard of the international laws of war, the readiness to fight the most radical way you can imagine, and, of course, the idea of total control of your own society for the war effort. So these 4 elements make up what the total war actually means. Now, how do you come to total war? It is a development that started way back in the 19th century, certainly in the Franco-Prussian War, because what you had here was the idea of the reality of people's war, meaning whole nations fighting war against each other, and at the same time mobilizing the economy, particularly industry. That was an industrial war. And that kind of warfare developed into the First World War, when the word was coined actually in France. So total war is a development that began in the late 19th century and ended up in World War II.
Thank you. It's often assumed that the Prussian state by the late 19th century is becoming quite militarized following the defeats at Auerstadt and Jena. And of course you get Gneisenau and others who are attempting to reform it. Was von der Goltz a supporter of that? Or to what extent do you think that change in Prussian society was actually shaping his thinking at this point?
Well, the interesting thing is, it is a myth that Prussia or Germany after 1871 was totally militarized. In fact, it was a strong civil society with liberty up to a certain extent and control of parliament up to a certain extent. What von der Goltz complaining about was the fact that Germany was not militarized enough. He wanted conscription to be fully carried out. You have to imagine that, for example, by 1900, the German army would only recruit about half, if not less than that, of those young men susceptible for conscription. So von der Goltz wanted to have them all in order to have a big army capable of fighting the French and the Russians. And he wanted to militarize society, not in the sense that everybody should march according to Prussian tradition, but young people should train for war, even since childhood. Other generals and leading officers had similar ideas.
Tell us more about von der Goltz's experience in the Ottoman Empire.
Von der Goltz ran in trouble with the German military authorities because he was a fierce critic of their conservative politics. So he escaped really from Germany to the Ottoman Empire in 1883 and stayed there for 12 years, helping to modernize the Ottoman army and also helping the German arms industry to sell their weapons to the Ottoman Empire. Apart from giving military advice, he also supported the young Turkish nationalists. And that played an important role during World War I when he returned to the Ottoman Empire to become one of the army commanders, First Army in Istanbul, Constantinople. He supported and even advocated the genocide of the Armenians because he regarded the Armenians as a danger to the Ottoman war effort. So he was actually a war criminal.
That's interesting you say that, Professor, because in one of our other episodes, another author has commented on some of the extreme views held by von der Goltz and had suggested, in the context particularly of 1914 and his role in Belgium, that there was criminality there. But you're suggesting it's also perhaps even more so in the Ottoman environment that war criminality occurs. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair. It's much more the case in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. Actually, in 1914, with the German invasion of Belgium, von der Goltz was not in command of any troops. He didn't have anything to do with all these atrocities directly. However, in his theoretical analysis in his books, he had always advocated war against civilians as being one of the important means of winning a war onto France.
So really a particularly good example, good in the sense of a well-chosen example of this whole tendency towards total war. Now, as we move on, perhaps to the next strategist and also practitioner, Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen of the famous Schlieffen Plan. Schlieffen did not live to see his plan of 1905 put into practice. He died on the eve of the First World War. But tell us about the strategist and about the plan, and tell us to what extent there was continuity between that and the ideas of total war and von der Goltz that you've just been talking about.
No, there was not much continuity. In fact, there was a lot of difference. The thing is that Schlieffen actually never really commanded a larger unit in war, but he became the Chief of General Staff in 1891, and he faced the big strategic dilemma of the German General Staff, the danger of a war on two fronts against Russia and France. And the question was how to face this danger. Von der Goltz and others advocated something like radical war, total war. The word didn't exist yet, but the tendency was clear. Schlieffen thought the best way of dealing with it would be a short, sharp war against one of these enemies, in particular against France. So he concentrated on minute operational planning in order to smash the French army within a few weeks. The idea was then to fight the Russian army, to face it with the German army being transported across Germany to the Eastern Front. So Schlieffen was really an advocate of minute, exact operational planning. And in that respect, he was a bureaucrat, in contrast to von der Goltz or Moltke, for example, who were always ready to improvise during war, whereas Schlieffen thought the best idea would be pre-planning the war in every detail.
Schlieffen was not alone in wanting to eliminate accident and fortune from war. There had been tendencies of this before. In the late 18th century, where somebody like von Bülow tried very hard to make war something that was mathematically pre-planned and executed. To what extent do you think this is really a completely wrong approach? And to what extent do you sympathize with the fact that he tried to make this war according to railway timetables? The alternative from what you are telling us would have been this Goltzian total mobilization of society. Wasn't Schlieffen's approach one which would have been more humane? And in fact, wouldn't it have been to some extent much more maneuverist, given that he was trying to do this indirect approach and not one of slogged out battle? That was not his plan. It didn't work like that. It didn't work out the way he planned it. But nevertheless, I wonder to what extent it's right to blame him for what came after the lack of success of his plan.
Well, what you really have to do is to look at the details of his military planning. First of all, he also advocated the utmost armament of the German army, meaning recruiting as many soldiers as possible. He needed that for his plan. The right wing was to march through Belgium and originally the Netherlands into northern France in order to encircle the whole of the French army. So for that, you need a big army. That was certainly not anything like a humane warfare, because one of the important things is, of course, that if you attack neutral countries and France in such a way, civilians are in the way. So you brush them aside. If necessary, you kill them. But the big mistake Schlieffen made was to underestimate the distances the army had to march. And don't forget, they had to do it on foot. There were few trucks and certainly no tanks. So the army was relatively slow. And in order to carry out this strategic idea of the big envelopment, they should have been much faster. It worked in World War II, as you know, but then World War I, that was impossible. And the other thing is, Schlieffen disregarded logistics. That meant the army would march into Belgium and then into France. And the further they advanced, the less they got the supplies. Perhaps they got ammunition, but certainly they didn't get any food supplies. They were supposed to live off the land, which meant, again, problems for the civilian population. And they were supposed to carry their big guns with horses, but the horses wouldn't get any fodder. And the consequences were, of course, that in the end, at the Battle of the Marne in 1914, the German army was much weaker than it had begun. So the whole plan was ridiculous. And one of the biggest problems was the fact that Schlieffen was such a bureaucrat. He would not allow his army leaders to improvise, to act on their own according to Prussian tradition, but they were supposed to obey orders, strictly obey orders. Now, how do you do that if you are way back and behind the army, trying to telephone them? That does not always work. At that time, communication was difficult. They were given precise orders beforehand, but of course, war isn't like that. There are always chances, coincidences, things work differently than expected. So Schlieffen's plan could not work.
Thank you. I wondered to what extent von Schlieffen then influenced German thinking, because what we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment, challenges with logistics, a philosophy that doesn't encourage the mission command that you've spoken about. Is there any evidence that von Schlieffen was influential in some of Russian military thinking?
No, nothing to do with that. The Prussian or even German military tradition was very different. During the War of Unification under Moltke, he had a tendency not to give orders, but to give directives, meaning the army commanders, the group commanders were given an objective and they themselves had to decide how to reach that objective. That was very different from what the Russian army does now or what it did during World War II. And it was very different from Schlieffen's idea. Again, Schlieffen was not a commander of the Russian general staff, and he didn't have Russian soldiers. Now, his idea was a bureaucratic idea. If you're working it out precisely beforehand, then you could achieve miracles. That was his idea. And you mustn't forget, one of the reasons why he could come up with ideas like this was that since the mid-19th century, warfare on land was largely dependent on railroads. Railroads have timetables. Now, if you manage to get the whole war according to timetable, then you would have an advantage over your enemy. So this was the idea. The only problem was that as the German army marched into France, they lost their connection to the railroads because the railroads was way behind them. And of course, the Belgians and the French, when they withdrew, blew up the bridges and tunnels. So railroads couldn't be used to support the armies anymore.
In other words, you can't set up Schlieffen as the better example than von der Goltz of Prussian thinking, a positive character, and von der Goltz as a more negative character. What would von der Goltz have made of Schlieffen's plan?
Well, von der Goltz, he thought that this man was mediocre and he didn't understand modern warfare. The one thing about von der Goltz is he really had a sarcastic sense of humor, and Schlieffen didn't have any sense of humor whatsoever. So personally, they didn't like each other. The other thing is that von der Goltz would have loved to be chief of the general staff. Instead, it was Schlieffen. So, well, they didn't go on well together. Unfortunately for Goltz, when Schlieffen retired, he didn't get the job. Instead, it was Moltke the Younger who got the job, the nephew of the winner of the Franco-Prussian War. So von der Goltz was probably the more interesting thinker and theorist. Only he was completely reckless. And he advocated war in a sense that was absolutely horrible. No holds barred, everything allowed in order to win this war. And that was a step towards total war.
Very interestingly, that shows that there was no completely homogeneous Prussian school, but that there was a diversity of opinion and is also built into the personal rivalries. Can we now turn to the third of your Prussian thinkers, Friedrich von Bernhardi? Just a little bit younger than von der Goltz, born in 1849. He died in 1930, and he was actually born in St. Petersburg, so he was not a pure Prussian, but more of a Baltic mix there. And he, of course, wrote really influential books both on the eve of the First World War and then after the First World War, which makes him, in a way, the more modern of the three. He'd written the On War Today, and then Germany and the Next War, and then after the First World War, the War of the Future in the light of the First World War. Now, let's turn to Friedrich von Bernhardi, and how do you classify him, and what can you tell us about him and his ideas?
Well, in a way, he radicalized von der Goltz. Von der Goltz already had these social Darwinist tendencies, these views of the world that war would be something about the nations and their survival in the eternal struggle of the peoples worldwide. Bernhardi even went further than that. He, in his book, 1912, Germany and the Next War, actually advocated that war was a biological necessity. Without war, German society would degenerate and they would just try to live in luxury. Von der Goltz said similar things, but mainly in his private letters. One of the letters he wrote to a friend was in 1907, "I wish two things for Germany. One is total impoverishment, and the other one, a hard war for years. And then they would recover as a strong nation, perhaps." Bernhardi even radicalized that. So in that respect, he was an advocate of really total war. And he was a pre-runner of what the Nazis did in World War II. The approach to military tactics, military operation, and even strategy, in that respect, he was slightly old-fashioned. He was a fierce critic of Schlieffen. He completely disliked the idea of bureaucratic planning. However, One of the important things Schlieffen said was that in modern warfare, with these enormous firearms, the destructiveness of firearms, you cannot do any frontal attacks anymore because you would sacrifice your troops. So the important thing is the flank attacks or even to surround the enemy. Now, Bernhardi, being a cavalry officer originally, still advocated frontal attacks. And he thought, well, that would make sense. While you lose a few thousand men, the next wave will actually manage to get through. Yeah, but this is precisely what the Russians did in World War II. The other thing is, Schlieffen had written in one of his articles that the modern military genius leader of the armies wouldn't be at the front. He wouldn't far away from the front, and telephone and give orders to the army commanders. Now, von der Goltz said, no way, that mustn't happen. Instead, the chief of the general staff or the leader of the armies has to be at the front. He has to give direct orders. Great idea. Now, how do you do that if the front is several hundred kilometers long? In some respect, he had some old-fashioned ideas that was reminiscence of warfare in the 19th century.
Fascinating that you have told us just how much these three thinkers prepared the way for the Second World War as well as for the First. Could you just say a little bit more about how their ideas influenced thinkers beyond Germany? Because the works were translated into English, they were very widely read, so some of them were translated into French as well. And could you say that they not only radicalized thinking about war in Germany, but also prepared all the other countries for a much more bloody First World War and then Second World War?
Well, Britain is a difficult case in that context because it largely relied on the Navy and World War II and the Air Force as well. Only during World War I and then World War II, the army was really fully equipped with soldiers by conscription. Now, the influence of people like von der Goltz and Bernhardi was perhaps stronger in France, also in Russia, where the idea of total mobilization of the population had a good foundation because of conscription. In Britain, that, of course, began to play an important role during World War I, second half of World War I, with the introduction of conscription, and then, of course, World War II as well. But the other important thing one should not forget is that this theory of social Darwinism, as expressed by von der Goltz and particularly Bernhardi, that played an important role in World War II in terms of radical racism. One of the most ardent believers in the idea of social Darwinism was Adolf Hitler. If you read his books, particularly Mein Kampf, this is social Darwinism pure. And people like von der Goltz and Bernhardi played an important role as influences in that respect. Well, they weren't mentioned by Hitler, Goebbels, and the others, but the idea that was created and fostered by people like von der Goltz and Bernhardi certainly played a role in the development of that ideology. One more thing, Schlieffen is also interesting. The idea of bureaucratic pre-planning of a military campaign didn't take hold anymore. During the 1920s, Schlieffen was celebrated by his disciples as the most important military thinker. However, nobody ever came up with the idea again to have a detailed pre-planned operation like in 1914. The German invasion of Belgium and France and Netherlands in 1940, the invasion of Russia, much of that was improvised. And nobody came up with the idea of having a detailed plan. So Schlieffen was basically dead.
Von der Goltz and Bernhardi weren't the only ones thinking in social Darwinist terms at the time. You've got Friedrich Ratzel and Johann Rudolf Kielen, who are also influential in the development of Lebensraum, which becomes something the Nazis then used to justify the growth of the state. To what extent is there evidence to suggest that these people were either personally known to each other or their ideas were helping to influence and create a kind of zeitgeist, which social Darwinism becomes an acceptable approach, despite the horrors you've highlighted already, from von der Goltz and the Ottoman genocides and so on?
You cannot limit your analysis on army leaders, officers, and generals. There was a strong development towards social Darwinism inside German society. By the way, in French society as well, also in the United States, and to a certain extent, even in Britain. In Germany, it was the new right, which developed since the 1890s. One of the most important and prominent groups was the Pan-German League, and they proclaimed Darwinism at least as radical as Bernhardi and von der Goltz. And they also advocated war as the strengthening of society and so on. So that was an important development in Germany, a social development, a political development by the new right. However, one should not overestimate the strength of these groups before 1914. So there was a mixed picture of German society. However, when the war broke out in 1914, the consequences were catastrophic. And then, of course, the defeat of Germany with all these catastrophic consequences during the 1920s. This helped to foster the idea of social Darwinism into fascism and Nazism and even aggressive anti-Semitism. So had World War I not happened, I think the social Darwinists would have just have petered out somehow.
Professor Förster, you've shown us how very much these three thinkers influenced not just the First World War, but also the horrors then of the Second World War. This was an extremely interesting conversation. Thank you very much for having joined us here today, and all the very best for the future. And I hope your book will be translated into English.
Thank you for joining us. This has been a RUSI podcast in which we have been talking strategy. The podcast is available via the RUSI website at rusi.org and on all major platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And to be notified about when future episodes are available, you can follow RUSI on social media. Thank you for listening, and Beatrice and I hope that you can join us for our next conversation, where we'll be talking about Jacques-Antoine Hippolyte Comte de Guibert, who was highly influential in shaping the American Army following the War of Independence. We will be joined by Dr. Jonathan Abel from the US Army Staff College for that conversation.